You ready, bro?
Nah, nigga, what the fuck? What's that? Some background music. You can see? This lecture is obviously called You Are Not Speaking Ancient Hebrew. A bit of historical background first. The old biblical or classical Hebrew was spoken some 35,000, 3,000 years ago. The core of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, traditionally believed to have been first recorded 33,000 years ago, is written in biblical Hebrew, obviously, hence the name. This language is undoubtedly a member of the Semitic family. It was a living spoken language and it kept changing through time. But for external reasons to do with the Bar Kokhba War of 135 CE, exile and diaspora, Hebrew gradually became extinct as a spoken language around 200 CE. Yet it continued to be used as a liturgical and written language for many centuries thereafter. It was used for prayer and to write books and documents in a variety of fields, including not just religions, but also law, business, philosophy, literature, and medicine. Furthermore, it was spoken by Jewish traders as a second language, lingua franca for communication between Jews from different lands. But crucially, it was not spoken by anyone as native, a mother tongue. This is what makes us analyze it as a dead language. Whether Hebrew was revived from the dead or created from scratch, it is now spoken by some 5 million people natively and serves as the national language of the state of Israel. It is now once again living spoken language and it keeps changing. So what exactly happened in those early revival years? And how did Hebrew once again become a living language? This is that Babylon exile, also called Babylon captivity, that forced detention of Jews in Babylonia following the latter's conquest of the kingdom of Judah in about 600 BCE. And that's when the exile ended in 538 BC. So that give you a time frame of when the language supposedly went extinct. I'm gonna let that whole go out. Okay. If we need to put a date on the beginning of the process of the Hebrew language revival, a term I will use for now, it must be October 13th, 1881, when a man called Eliezer ben Yehuda and his friends agreed to exclusively speak Hebrew in their conversations. Thus, Eliezer ben Yehuda is usually credited with the feat of reviving Hebrew. Who was he and what did he do? He was born Eliezer Yitzhak Perelman in 1858 in that part of Russian Empire where Russians, Belarusians, Poles, and Lithuanians lived side by side with a large Jewish population. At the at the age of 3, he started learning in Zeder, a school for young children, where he learned biblical Hebrew. By the time he was 12, Ben Yehuda was familiar with large portions of Torah, Mishnah, and Talmud. Hoping he would become rabbi, his parents sent him to yeshiva, where he continued studying Torah and biblical Hebrew. In addition to biblical Hebrew, he studied Lithuanian, Yiddish, Hebrew, and Arabic. And in the following years, he also learned French, German, and Russian from his first wife, Deborah, and traveled to Donauberg, Litva, and later to Paris for further education. With his rise of Jewish nationalism in the 19th century Europe, Ben Yehuda was captivated by the innovative ideas of Zionism. While reading the Hebrew language newspaper Hashahar, he became acquainted with Zionism and other political ideas of the day. Among those ideas was the belief that one of the criteria needed to define a nation worthy of national rights was its use of a common language spoken by both the society and the individual. This made Ben Yehuda conclude that the reviving the Hebrew language in the land of Israel would unite all Jews worldwide. In fact, Ben Yehuda regarded Hebrew and Zionism as one and the same, writing that the Hebrew language can live only if we revive the nation and return it to the fatherland. Talking about Israel. This that's the white dude, Ben Yehuda or whatever. Now this is Zionist colonization. This is what he support in land question in Palestine. With the blessings of the League of Nations under British protection, the Zionist plan for colonization of Palestine entered a new phase. Emboldened by the Balfour Declaration's implications in British colonial presence between 1919 and 1923, around 35,000 Jewish immigrants, mostly from Russia, arrived in Palestine. The fourth was predominantly from Poland, and by 1929 there were about 160,000 Jews in Palestine. So he was basically supporting the colonization of Palestine. The fifth increased Palestinian Jewish population exponentially when nearly 160,000 Jews settled in the region, while in 1919 there were only 65,000 Jewish immigrants settled in Palestine. Okay, so in 1881, Ben Yehuda moved to Palestine, then ruled by the Ottoman Empire, where he settled in Jerusalem, and on October 13th made the fateful decision to speak only Hebrew, both in his home with his wife Deborah and outside the home as well. With his like-minded Hebrew revivalist friends, thus he set out to achieve his self-proclaimed goal, which he later formulated as to create a new language which is completely old. To this end, Ben Yehuda, who by then had adopted his Hebrew name, became a major figure in the establishment of the Committee of the Hebrew Language. Later, the Academy of the Hebrew Language, an organization that still exists today. It was also Ben Yehuda who wrote the first modern Hebrew dictionary and invented a word for it, melon. Many of the words he coined have become part and parcel of the language, but others, some 2,000 words, never caught on. Like his word for tomato. And here goes source from the Historical Dictionary of Israel. The revival of the Hebrew language was closely associated with the work of Eliezer ben Yehuda, who arrived in Palestine in 1881 and sought to promote the use of Hebrew as a spoken language. There was an opposition from skeptics who felt the language was not rich enough to deal with the contemporary matters, and from the ultra-religious who object to the use of the sacred language for practical, everyday concerns. There was a vocabulary gap as a consequence of centuries of limited use. Ben Yehuda founded the Hebrew Language Council in 1890 for the purpose of coining and creating new Hebrew words for modern usage. After the independence of Israel, this body became the Hebrew Language Academy. Hebrew made great strides among the pioneers who in Palestine prior to 1948 and was enriched by the time of Israel's independence. in the influx Israel of hundreds of thousands of new immigrants. In early 1950s, you would have to learn Hebrew to become integrated into the society of the new state. Okay, this is from a book from Paul Wexler, Jewish and non-Jewish creators of the Jewish languages. The present paper will claim that much of the lexicon of Yiddish and some of the lexicon of Hebrew, both the unspoken pre-Hebrew developed by Yiddish speakers attested since the late 13th century and spoken modern Hebrew created in the 1800s, can be predicted by a German-Slavic bilingual. This is possible since both Yiddish and the Hebrew of Yiddish speakers use Slavic grammars with an overwhelmingly non-Slavic lexicon. Yiddish is a merged Slavic language consisting of Upper Sorbian and Key Polesian grammar and phonology. That became reflex to High German vocabulary, while pre-modern Hebrew written by Yiddish speakers in modern Hebrew are Yiddish reflex to old vocabulary. I will show that it is Slavic grammar that determines the choice of the collaboration. In absence of native speakers of Hebrew, both the pre-modern and modern Hebrew invented by Yiddish speakers could only be based on Yiddish Slavic grammar. Hence, just like the Yiddish pre-modern and modern Hebrew are also multi-titered or whatever, West and East Slavic languages. Yiddish is almost the only living language whose membership within the Indo-European family is the subject of debate. While pre-modern, modern are the only language whose Indo-affiliation is not commonly accepted. Reflexication means that the Jews retain Sorbian grammar, phonology, and phonetics while replacing most of the original lexicon with German phonetic strings. So it's really a German language. So modern Hebrew has become a fascination among linguistics and laymen alike. In this book, the author claims modern Hebrew is not a direct continuation of monolingual Semitic Hebrew. Modern Hebrew was created when Yiddish speakers reflexed their language, to biblical and Mishnaic Hebrew. This partial language shift resulted in the superimposition of Semitic Hebrew vocabulary on a Yiddish syntax and phonology, and the creation of form of Yiddish with a bizarre vocabulary, but not a Semitic language. Modern British Hebrew is thus a dialect of Yiddish. Contrary to conception, Yiddish is a Slavic language derived from Sorbian. Thus, modern Hebrew is a Slavic language. So it's not an ancient African language. This is a page out the lexicon of ancient Hebrew that a lot of people use. I actually asked to borrow this from the Hebrew just to make sure it was one that they was using. And if you read under the purpose of the lexicon, this is in their book. In order to demonstrate the need for an ancient Hebrew lexicon, let us examine the word Hallel and how it is written and what it means. The Hebrew word, as it appears here in Hebrew dictionaries and in Hebrew Bibles, is written with the modern Hebrew script. But where did the modern Hebrew script come from? Hebrew, it was originally written with a pictographic script, similar to Egyptian hieroglyphs. But when Israel was taken into captivity in Babylon, they adopted the Aramaic script of the region, and it was used to write Hebrew. The modern Hebrew script used today is in fact a Aramaic in origin, not Hebrew. Oh shit. Bro, that shit's funny. Whew. Just change the page. Okay. Another Another early scholar who investigated this matter was Lewis Capel, who wrote during the early 17th century an article in 1948 edition of Encyclopedia Britannica includes the following information regarding his research of Masoretic texts. As a Hebrew scholar, he concluded that the vowel points and accents were not an original part of Hebrew, but were inserted by the Masoretic Jews of the Tiberias, not earlier than the 5th century AD, and that the primitive Hebrew characters are Aramaic and were substituted for the more ancient at the time of captivity. Various readings in the Old Testament text and various differences between the ancient versions and the Masoretic text convinced him that the integrity of the Hebrew text as held by Protestants was untenable. Many Protestants loved the Masoretic text, believing it to be a trustworthy presentation of the original Hebrew text of Scripture, yet at the same time most Protestants reject the Orthodox Church tradition as being untrustworthy. They believe that the Church's oral tradition could not possibly preserve truth over a long period of time. Okay, so adding vowel points. For thousands of years, ancient Hebrew was only written with consonants and no vowels. When reading these texts, they had to supply all of the vowels from memory based on oral tradition. In Hebrew, just like modern language, vowels can make a big difference. The change of a single vowel can radically change the meaning of a word. An example in English is the difference between slap and slip. These words have different definitions, yet if our language is written without vowels, both of these words will be written SLP. Thus, the vowels are very important. Most of the extensive change the Masoretics brought to the Hebrew text was the addition of vowel points in an attempt to solidify for all the correct readings of all the Hebrew scriptures. The Masoretics added a series of dots to the text, identifying which vowel to use in any given location. Okay. Obviously, one cannot discuss Hebrew pronunciation without first discussing Hebrew vowels. What most people don't realize is that at least 3 different enunciation systems for denoting vowels were invented for Hebrew, each in a different center of Jewish society. In manuscripts, one finds evidence of the Babylonian vocalization, the Palestinian vocalization, and the Tiberian vocalization. These systems all came into being around the same time. The Tiberian notion has 7 different vowel systems. Whatever I'm familiar with, the Babylonian closely corresponds to the Palestinian notion, as it does not distinguish between the Psach and the Kamats, nor does it distinguish between the Segal or the Tazari similarity. It is clear that the traditional Taimani pronunciation is descended from the Babylonian vowel notion system, since it only uses 6 vowel sounds. Most fascinating, only recently Taimani scribes used the Babylonian vowels. It is important to note that although the written vowels came about in 700 CE, they reflect much older oral tradition. Okay. So in short, Biblical Hebrew is an ancient language. A lot of the ancient scriptures in the Bible were written in it, and it died. Well, not died, but evolved. Modern Hebrew. So did modern Hebrew die as a language? Not completely. Hebrew experienced a revival in the 19th century. Now, what we know as modern Hebrew, as this was a part of the Zionist movement. So if you supporting this language, you are supporting the Zionist movement, pretty much. During this movement, Elijah Ben Judah, the dude we talked about, he made a dictionary of it. He made the first one. Because of this, the European influence on the language, Hebrew changed as a language. Almost all aspects of the language were changed: pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary. In short, modern Hebrew was brought back, but it has changed quite a bit. Northwest Indo-European language and the modern Indo-European language or European languages. It is important to note that even though there is a great belief that modern Hebrew and ancient Hebrew are the same languages among Israeli scholars, there have been continued calls for the modern Hebrew language to be called Israeli Hebrew, or preferably just Israeli, due to the strong divergencies that exist and further develop with its use between the modern language spoken in Israel and its theoretical basis. The ancient Hebrew of the Tanakh, its contents and language variations having been compiled probably between 450 and 200 BC, i.e. when the language was being substituted by Aramaic. On the interesting question, Professor Gilead Zuckerman considers that Israelis are brainwashed to believe they speak the same language as the prophet Isaiah, a purely Semitic language, but this is false. It's time we acknowledge that Israeli is very different from the Hebrew of the past. He points out to the abiding influence of modern Indo-European dialects, especially Yiddish, Russian, and Polish, and vocabulary, syntax, and phonetics, as imported by Israeli founders. The same could certainly be said of Cornish and other language revivals, and even of some deaf languages with a considered use of the modern Latin language used by the Catholic Church, which is not comparable to the classical Latin used by Cicero. But in scholarly or ritual context, the method of pronouncing Hebrew had been forgotten. After the dispersion to the return of from Babylon, Hebrew, in common with the Semitic languages, does not write its vowels. Thus, its transmission as a spoken language can only be effected by oral example and tradition. The same is true of Arabic, the only living Semitic language. The form of spoken Hebrew which Israel has invented will be meaningless to a member of a Hebrew-speaking tribe of, let us say, the 7th century BC, which is approximately the last time the language was general vernacular use. Even by the time of Christ, Hebrew was, as a spoken language, had virtually disappeared. The earliest followers of Christ, though all of them were Jews, spoke Aramaic, one of the languages extensively spoken throughout the Near East at the end of the first millennium BC. One of the first rules One of the first rules one learns in historical linguistics is that all spoken languages are in a constant state of change. Only the rapidity and significance of the changes vary. Indeed, everything in language changes. The sounds, the morphology, word forms, the syntax, how words are put together to form a phrase, and even the intonation. Native speakers are aware of the different dialects of their own language. When a Brit talks about the boot of the lorry, the trunk of the truck, many Americans have no idea what he means, even if they are able to understand the pronunciation. This principle has several corollaries. One is that more time passes, the more difficult it is to understand the older forms of a particular language. Another is that one language whose speakers become separated from another will diverge first into two dialects, and with time, different languages. Spoken Latin diverged over time into many separate languages, of which Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, and Romanian survived. While we would all like to think that we read the Torah the same way our ancestors did, there are four that that our ancestors did 3 or 4,000 years ago. The likelihood is that we don't. As with other languages, Hebrew changed over time, even in the time of Shoftim, when we find the members of different tribes pronounced Hebrew differently, as the story in Shoftim 12:5 illustrates. Today, the three main traditional pronunciation systems of Hebrew have survived and are used in synagogues around the globe. This question says, let's see, since numerous and significant differences exist between the three traditional systems, the obvious question is which pronunciation system adheres most closely to the tradition? In other words, which one is more correct? This question has no clear answer. Unfortunately, there are no YouTube videos or vinyl recordings illustrating how Abraham or Moses spoke. No one can prove that pronunciation system more accurately reflects how the Jews in Israel spoke thousands of years ago. We only have written evidence, yet records do not record the pronunciation of words. Okay. This is from a lexicon of Jewish names in late antiquity. According to legend and tradition, the divine name was known to the original people of Israel and was used by them. This is the same name that was suppressed in vocalization of which was ultimately prohibited. After centuries of being conquered and dispersed by other tribes and traditions, the Israelis lost the true pronunciation of the divine name. The real sound of whatever Yahweh disappeared, and how could this have happened? Modern Hebrew is a language without any specific vowel sounds. It is commonly believed that all the words in the original Torah, Hebrew for the first 5 books of the Old Testament, were simply consonants with no vowels. Thus, when reading the Torah, people could encounter problems in pronunciation. Imagine if I wrote the consonant CT. This could be read and pronunciated as either cat, cut, or cot. As you can see, using 3 different vowels creates 3 very different sounding words. from these consonants. Each of these three words also has a very different meaning. The Torah was most frequently transmitted through an oral tradition. A Jew was supposed to know it so well that when he came upon a word, he would recognize what it was because he had been taught it through constant exposure to the sounds, usually through the repetition of the sacred text. But if a word was suppressed or forbidden, how would you know its true sound? What if you weren't allowed to vocalize a word? How could you know what it was? After centuries of not being allowed to vocalize the name, it seems obvious that one would lose direct understanding of how the name sounded. No one knows exactly when, but the actual vocalization of the divine name became lost. Many sources suggest that Yahweh may have been the pronunciation, but this is just a guess. There are many other guesses, such as Jehovah, which is actually a translation of into first Greek, and then into Latin. And contemporary Hebrew vowel sounds are created by a series of dots and dashes known as vowel points, which were added to the text in order to standardize the pronunciation of the words. This happened around AD 700 before the standardization pronunciation of the Torah occurred through oral information being passed down from generation to generation. So, pull me some. Pull me some. Alright, this is vowels and dialects. It is well known that the original Hebrew language did not have vowels, and often we can only guess at the pronunciation of names either because we have ancient Greek versions of them or because we have an oral tradition of how they were pronounced, which in the Middle Ages became stabilized through the dot system. Now we get the point. Everybody know what a dialect is. Alright. I'm from a book called Know Your Religion. Appreciate it, bro. Alright, this is from a book called Know Your Religions. Alright, so first let us examine the problem of how to correctly pronounce and write the divine name. Accidentally, biblical Hebrew had no vowels. Biblical Hebrew had no vowels. Thus, proper pronunciation in biblical times was greatly dependent upon the oral transferring of words. Vowel points were not added to Hebrew until more than 500 years after the death of Jesus. Thus, the correct pronunciation of the Hebrew name of God is simply unknown today. One reputable scholar text says, the pronunciation of Yahweh is a scholarly guess. Hebrew biblical manuscripts were principally consonantal in spelling until well into the current era. The pronunciation of words was transmitted in a separate and oral tradition. The tetrahedron was not pronounced at all, the word my Lord being pronounced in its place Elohim, God, was substituted in cases of the combination, though the consonants remained in the original pronunciation was eventually lost. When the Jewish scholars added vowel sounds to the biblical manuscripts sometime before the 10th century, the tetragrammaton, or whatever, was punctuated with the vowels of the word Elohim to indicate that the reader should read Lord or God instead of accidentally pronouncing the sacred name. From Jehovah results from reading to consonants of the tetrahedrogram, vowels of the surrogate word Elohim. The decimation of this form is usually traced to Petrus Galatinus, confessor to Pope Leo X, I think, who in 1518 AD transliterated the 4 Hebrew letters with Latin letters JVVH together with the vowels of Elohim, producing the artificial form Jehovah. This confused usage may, however, have begun as early as 1100 AD, while the hybrid form of Jehovah has met much resistance and is universally regarded as an ungrammatical abbreviation. It nonetheless passed from Latin into English. It's not Hebrew. It's about to read, bro. I can read it, though. Okay. It is no wonder St. Jerome, 340-420, who published the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible, admitted, when we translate the Hebrew into Latin, we are sometimes guided by conjecture. Furthermore, G. Lee, 1657-1776, a Swiss Protestant theologian and scholar, even went so far as to maintain that the learned merely guess at the sense of the Old Testament in an infinity of places. Man, bro, I'm telling you, bro, this is only a little bit, and this is a lot, but this is just a little bit. Boy, I'm finna show y'all. Oh man. This is in large part because the ancient Hebrews' failure to write down their vowels and of large subsequently falling into disuse, and the adding of the relatively modern vowels by a few belated Dark Age rabbis in order to make up for this deficit naturally cast very great suspicion and doubts on the Hebrew vowels were originally sounded and used. Verifying the recent appearance of these vowel points, the renowned J. Patterson Smith, author of several books on the Bible, maintained that these marks are of comparatively modern date, certainly not older than about 500 or 600 AD. And he added, we can imagine then what a sensation was produced when a very famous Hebrew scholar, whatever his name is, about 1540, proved to the world that these vowel marks were not in existence for hundreds of years after the time of our Lord. Of course, this caused some controversy at the time, but Dr. Smith concluded that no scholar now thinks of doubting the comparatively recent origin of the Hebrew vowel points. Nobody today knows for sure how the origin of Hebrew was pronounced, regardless of the tales commonly propagated about the Jewish rabbis carrying on an accurate oral tradition for thousands of years. Our knowledge of evolution of languages would almost certainly deny the likely possibility of such. If old King Solomon were to walk through Jerusalem today and hear the Hebrew spoken there now, he would probably stop in astonishment, listen in amazement, shake his head in bewilderment, and finally conclude that he must be in a foreign country. And that's from a book called Language in Time of Revolution. During the revival of the language, its propagandists were particularly concerned with what was lacking in the vocabulary and the necessary innovation of words. But in the equally radical, though less conscious revolution took place in the area of syntax, rarely observed by the practitioners themselves. Some typical markers of biblical syntax were abandoned, and the construction of complex sentences with subordinate clauses modeled on European languages opened the Hebrew text to general modern thought and culture. So that's just telling y'all right there that the whole Hebrew Bible is off European thought and culture. That's why it is what it is. It don't matter what you have, the Torah, all of that. What was that, man? Henceforth, in principle, it is possible to write in Hebrew whatever could be expressed in European literatures in words where lacking substitutes could be found, borrowed, or coined in Hebrew. If today some of these writings may look simple-minded and old-fashioned, or on the contrary difficult and esoteric, this is because of the amazing dynamism that characterize the changes in the vocabulary and in the forms of expression of the Hebrew language in recent generations. Okay, more sources. Okay. Okay, this is from a old encyclopedia. It's an old arts, science, and literature encyclopedia from 1819 from in London. Okay. All right. Okay. On laying down these preliminaries, it was easy for Dr. Robertson to reduce Hebrew verse to the, I won't say that's Arabic or whatever matter, but so long as the Hebrew pronunciation and the quantity of their vowels remain unknown. To attempt the analysis of Hebrew verse by all those languages and other meters is to lay a superstructure without a foundation. And this is in 1819. He's saying that to try to use all those languages to make an analysis on Hebrew is to lay a superstructure without a foundation. As to real quantity, the meter and rhythm of these from the present state of the language seem to be altogether unknown, which is the necessary consequence of our uncertainty of the pronunciation. To some of those indeed who have labored in this manner, thus of merit is to be allowed that they have rendered the Hebrew which without their methods found it uncommonly harsh, in some degree polished, and more agreeable. They have indeed furnished it with a sort of verification and metrical arrangement when baffled in their attempts to discover the real. That's in 1819 in a damn encyclopedia and a universal dictionary. That was baffled in their attempts to discover the real. I read that part. Okay, here go old Hebrew grammar thing. Okay, the Jewish grammar. This is about the stem. You know what I'm saying? Stem and the root. I'm gonna show you what the root is in a second. Others regard the three stem consonants as a root, in the sense that considered as vowels and unpronounceable, it represents the common foundation of the verbal and nominal stems developed from it, just as in the vegetable world, from which the figure is borrowed, stems grow from the hidden root. So this is I cut the date off, but this is way back then. They telling you way then is unpronounceable. For the investigation of the actual condition of the language, however, this hypothesis of unpronounceable roots with indeterminate meaning is fruitless. Moreover, the root, as it is generally understood by linguists, cannot apply to Semitic triliteral stem. Come on. It's not, man, bro. Nigga, what? Bro, I told you. I told you, bro. I told you, fool. This is... Hebrew words and basics. So I'm finna tell you about what I just read to you about the with the roots. Hebrew words are based on roots. What he just said is unpronounceable, consisting of three consonants. So the very minute part of the fucking word is unpronounceable. So they had to make up everything. You know what I'm saying? So the whole Torah, you know what I'm saying? If they had to make up everything with European ideas, the whole Torah is made up. The whole thing is made up because they don't understand the very root. That's what the Torah is written in. That's what the oldest text supposed to be written in. So this is the smallest part of the language that they can't pronounce because they don't understand what it is. So they don't even understand the smallest part of the Torah. So the whole thing is made up. With European ideas. It just said they built the whole language off European ideas and they vowels. So they just made the damn story up. That's when Sonetta would drop the bomb like a bitch. Yeah. Various types of words are formed by modifying the triconsonant root. Modifications can be made by changing the vowels, adding the consonants before the word prefixes, after the word suffixes, or inside the word infixes. So this is the root, is what makes the entire word. You got to add on to the root just to make a word, right? Go back one slide and show you. I'm going to read this one more time. Others regard the three-stem consonant as a root. That's what we just looked at, those little three things that make the root. In the sense that considered as vowels and unpronounceable. It represents the common foundation. The foundation, bro. It represents the common foundation of the verbal and nominal stems developed from it. Just as in the vegetable world, from which the figure is borrowed, stems grow from the hidden root. Bro, you need that shit. But it's unpronounced. They don't know how they pronounced it. So they tell you they added the vowels. I done already showed you how they made the language into European ideas. So they just made the whole damn shit up. Got down to the very last root. To the motherfucking root. They telling you the root. You can't go no smaller than the root. Goddamn, what you want to see? The fuck? Hebrew verb basics. Verbs undergo I'm not even finna go. There ain't even no point. That shit. Let's just keep going. Okay. This is about the triliteral stems. I think I read just a second on that. On the other hand, a large number of triliteral stems really point to a biliteral base, which may be properly called a root, since it forms the starting point for several triliteral modifications of the same fundamental idea. So one root can mean a whole bunch of things, right? It can mean anything. You know what I'm saying? It can already mean anything. So they can make any word they want out of the Torah with any root. Look at this. They basically made that shit up. They made a language. Added their own vowels to it. Ooh, I wanted to say this. You know, so I add this vowel to make it say this. I'm going to keep it like this so it'll say this. Man. Let me finish this shit, bro. Since it forms a starting point of the for several triliteral modifications of the same fundamental idea. Though in themselves unpronounceable, these roots are usually pronounced with the I between the two consonants. What time is it, bro? I don't know how long I've been running this for. 12:51. Alright, I got some time. Yeah, I told you, bro. Game over, nigga. Okay, now we got to this. A radically different alphabet. This is the ancient Hebrew. This is the Hebrew y'all using now. But I showed you a lexicon for this at the beginning, where it's supposed to give you this, and they tell you in the lexicon that they didn't know what it was. But if you couldn't understand this bottom one, what make you think understand this shit? You can't understand the root. If Moses were to see a copy of Masoretic text, he wouldn't be able to read it. As discussed in this recent post, the original Old Testament scriptures were written in Paleo-Hebrew. That's ancient Hebrew, a text closely related to the ancient Phoenician writing system. The Masoretic text is written with an alphabet which is borrowed from Assyria, Persia, around the 6th or 7th century BC. It is almost 1,000 years newer than the form of writing used by Moses, David, and most of the Old Testament writers. So they didn't even understand. Bro, I'm saying. I'm saying it was something out here. I just try to make this one quick. I ain't trying to read all this one. Okay, so recent discoveries from the Dead Sea Scrolls, however, suggest that there were several different versions of the biblical books in the Second Temple. So they not only found one version, they got a whole bunch of different versions of Hebrew they don't understand to translate it however they want. Come on, bro. This shit common sense, really, bro. They can't translate the fucking root. They can't pronounce this shit. You can't pronounce this shit. How you know what they mean? You know what I'm saying? You ain't got no definition. You can give the word whatever meaning you want it, just by adding a vowel to it. Putting some more shit around the fucking root or whatever. You know what I'm saying? You manipulate that shit how you want. Fuck it. Throw some Slavic in there. So it's already, not only is the language just unknown, you got different texts. You know what I'm saying? I'm not finna go all that because I don't hear it. You know what I'm saying? This is an article I found. I just posted it to be funny because they tried to say Jacob was a part of the group of rabbis that added the vowels to the language. When we just seen in the book, it said it was 1,000 years after any of them even was alive. They'd lie straight to your face just so you'll believe in this shit. Just because they know you're not finna go look it up. So in final analysis, the dialects of the struggle between the Westerners and the purists was a blessing for the Hebrew language. Many foreign terms were replaced with the neologisms from a Hebrew or Semitic-looking root. There's some examples or whatever. I'm not going to kill those languages. But in place of Hebraized terms, new foreign words and concepts were introduced within the proportions of good taste allowed in a given genre. This was and is the cosmopolitan openness, as well as the Yiddish and Russian background of modern Hebrew. It is the openness that constructed a modern state with universities, literature, and an air force. So if you supporting this modern Hebrew, or even the ancient Hebrew for that fact, you are basically spreading colonization by linguistic imperialism. You've been imperialized. Mentally colonized by a made-up story. Before the revival of Hebrew speech, a Hebrew writer could already freely produce new Hebrew sentences in writing. Before the revival of the Hebrew speech, a Hebrew writer could already quite freely produce new Hebrew sentences in writing. But what about written dialogues? Another major achievement of Mendeley, whatever, was that he translated colloquial dialogues from Yiddish into Hebrew. This was because his major Hebrew books were translated from Yiddish, and the bulk of his Yiddish novels was taken up by dialogues. The transition had to provide Hebrew substitutes for what his heroes said is Yiddish. Since then, in Sophnar is as there were dialogues in Hebrew literature that were reflective, vivid, everyday conversations. They were imitations of conversations in Yiddish or some other language. Nevertheless, the tendency to monologues, ideological or exegetical what was still strong in Hebrew prose. Thus, Hebrew prose reported and invented living dialogue in a language in which no one conversed. Thus, Hebrew prose reported and invented living dialogue in a language in which no one conversed, and in internal monologues, in a language in which no one ruminated. Okay. We almost done. This is the last one. Modern English is often thought to be a difficult language to translate with its irregular spellings, numerous shades of meanings, variations, and pronunciations, incorporation of countless foreign words, difficult idioms, and other peculiarities and inconsistencies. You see, I can't talk this shit worth a damn. However, nonetheless, could begin to compare with one major translating difficulty found in the biblical language of Israel, especially since Hebrew ceased to be a commonly spoken language hundreds of years before Christ arrived. In regard to the Old Testament, the Hebrew language, as anciently written, was the most difficult of all languages to translate, wrote biblical scholar John E. Rimsberg in his work entitled The Bible, in one of 30 weekly installments from his book, which began to appear in The Truth Seeker at the beginning of January in 1901. He went to explain that. It was written from right to left. The words contained no written vowels. There were no intervening spaces between the words and no punctuation marks. Even, look, bro, that they could make anything. Even with the introduction of vowel points, dots, marks below the words that indicate vowel sounds. Many Hebrew words, as in English, have more than one meaning. Without these points as originally written, the number is increased 100-fold. 100-fold. This is in 1901 with 5 English words, bag, big, big, bog, and buy, are quite unlike and easily distinguished. Omit the vowels as the ancient Jews did, and we have 5 words exactly alike, or rather one word with 5 different meanings, or by 5-fold, 500 meanings. The Hebrew language was largely composed of several meanings, as there were no spaces between the words. It was sometimes hard to tell where a word began and where it ended. So you can start your words and end them. You can make whatever word you want. You know what I'm saying? From the original text. And then just, man, shit. Come on. Come on, man. Critical thinking. As there were no punctuation marks and no spaces between sentences, paragraphs, or even sections, it was often difficult to determine the meaning of a writer after the words have been deciphered. Game over.